At 7:19 p.m., Cynthia Weller called Daniel Mercer's backyard tower a rusting eyesore and moved to fine him in front of the entire HOA. His 8-year-old daughter sat in the second row holding a battery lantern. Then thunder rolled over Oak Hollow, and the room began to understand what that tower was really for. Oak Hollow Estates liked to describe itself as a neighborhood built on order. The brochures used phrases like protected values, architectural harmony, and community pride. The entrance sign was carved limestone. The hedges along the median were cut with geometric precision every Thursday before noon. Even the mailboxes stood at matching heights, painted the same approved shade of black, as if personal taste had been negotiated out of the place years earlier, and nobody had thought to ask for it back. At the center of that order stood Cynthia Weller. She had been president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association for 6 years, and she carried the role the way some people carry inherited jewelry, with visible pride and the unshakable belief that possession itself proved fitness. Cynthia was 52, sharp-featured, always composed, and known for speaking in the kind of professionally softened tone that somehow made a reprimand feel even colder. She did not shout. She did not need to. In Oak Hollow, a letter on embossed HOA stationery could do more damage than most arguments. 3 houses down from the retention pond, at the edge of a cul-de-sac called Briar Court, lived Daniel Mercer. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, usually tired, and carried the particular stillness of a man who spent his days solving practical problems no one else wanted. Daniel owned a small electrical contracting company that handled emergency installations, rural service upgrades, and storm hardening jobs for farms, clinics, and municipal buildings across 3 counties. He was good enough that county inspectors trusted his numbers and linemen returned his calls. He was not flashy enough for Oak Hollow. His truck was clean but old. His boots were always real boots, never decorative ones. He left before sunrise most mornings and returned with sawdust in the cab, copper dust on his sleeves, and the kind of fatigue that came honestly. Since his wife Elena had died 4 years earlier after a fast-moving illness that had rearranged his life in less than 11 months, Daniel had rebuilt everything around one person, his daughter, Rosie. Rosie Mercer was 8 years old and possessed the unnerving observational calm some children develop when grief arrives too early and stays too long. She wore her dark hair in uneven braids her father managed with determined inconsistency, kept a notebook full of weather sketches beside her bed, and had recently become fascinated by warning systems. Not in the abstract. Specifically, sirens, backup batteries, hand crank radios, the county map with flood routes marked in blue and red. She liked knowing what happened when other things stopped working. It was, Daniel sometimes thought, the child's version of what he did for a living. The tower in the backyard had started as a necessity and then become an argument. It stood just behind Daniel's detached workshop, rising 22 feet above the fence line in a narrow galvanized frame. At the top sat a compact weather station, a directional antenna, and a hardened signal relay Daniel had built into a sealed housing, with enough redundancy to make a municipal engineer pause and look twice. The lower side rack held battery enclosures and conduit runs that disappeared underground into the workshop, where an inverter bank, transfer switches, and a propane-supported backup unit formed the heart of a private microgrid capable of powering his home, his shop, and, if the load was managed carefully, far more than either. From Daniel's perspective, it was a legal accessory structure tied to emergency communications and backup power management, fully permitted through the county under agricultural resilience and contractor use provisions because the lot backed onto an easement corridor and his licensed business operated from the workshop. From Cynthia Weller's perspective, it was an eyesore. She called it many things before she settled on rusting tower. The phrase appeared first in an email sent at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning to Daniel, the Property Compliance Committee, and 2 board members who did not especially want to be included. Unapproved industrial apparatus, visible above fence line. The subject line read. The body of the message was longer than the issue required. Cynthia had a habit of expanding small objections until they sounded civic. She cited neighborhood character. She cited aesthetic degradation. She cited concern from multiple residents, though in truth only one had complained formally, and that complaint had come after Cynthia herself mentioned the structure during a wine and cheese social on Hawthorne Lane. She questioned whether the metal tower and attached utility hardware represented a safety hazard, a visual blight, and a possible reduction in surrounding property values. She ended with a notice of hearing. Daniel read the email standing in the open doorway of his workshop, while Rosie, seated cross-legged on the concrete floor nearby, colored cloud bands into one of her notebooks. He did not swear in front of her. He had become very disciplined about that. Instead, he read the message once, then a second time, then looked out toward the tower itself, standing gray and straight against the late afternoon sky. There were faint oxidation marks near one bracket where a batch of fasteners from an outside supplier had weathered badly before he replaced them. That, presumably, was the rust Cynthia meant. Not structural damage, not neglect. Surface staining on hardware no longer even in service. Rosie noticed his silence before she looked up. "Is it another letter?" she asked. Daniel folded the phone into his palm. "It's a meeting. About the tower?" He nodded. Rosie considered this with the seriousness she reserved for weather maps and unfair adults. "But the tower helps listen." He looked at her. "Yes, and the batteries help when the power goes out." "Yes." She returned to her drawing for a moment, then said, "So this is one of those meetings where people talk because they don't understand the thing?" A beat passed. Daniel almost smiled. Something like that. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening in the Oak Hollow Clubhouse, a low stone building near the pool where the board usually discussed landscaping contracts, holiday light violations, and whether basketball goals created visual clutter. The room had framed watercolor prints of local barns on the walls and the kind of polished conference table chosen to suggest seriousness without real consequence. That night, the consequence sat in a white envelope on Daniel's kitchen counter after Rosie had gone to bed. He opened it beneath the yellow light over the sink and found not only the hearing notice, but a preliminary fine schedule already drafted in anticipation of non-compliance. $200 for unauthorized exterior equipment, $50 per day for continued violation after final notice, separate review for possible legal action if the structure remained visible after ordered removal. He read the figures twice, not because the money would break him. It would not, because of what the numbers revealed. Cynthia Weller had not called a hearing to understand the tower. She had called one to remove it. Only later would Daniel understand how much of that urgency had to do with image, how much with control, and how much with the deeper fact that some people regard preparation itself as a kind of accusation. A man who builds for failure before it arrives is quietly suggesting that the polished systems around him may not be enough. People like Cynthia did not enjoy that implication. At 6:40 the next morning, Daniel stood in the backyard with a flashlight, checking conduit seals before leaving for a substation retrofit 20 miles south. The sky carried the heavy stillness of late summer before a pressure shift. Rosie stood at the back door in pajamas too warm for the season, holding her cereal bowl in both hands. "Do the sirens run on batteries?" she asked. Daniel looked up from the panel housing. "The county sirens?" She nodded. "They're supposed to have backup." "Supposed to?" He tightened one latch and straightened. "Supposed to means the design says yes. It doesn't always mean maintenance says yes." Rosie absorbed that. She had inherited Elena's way of listening without interruption. Daniel felt it every time. The child did not just hear answers. She stored them. At school that day, Rosie drew the tower again. Not as an ugly thing. Not as the HOA described it, as a tall, narrow line with arrows showing signal direction and little yellow squares underground marking battery banks. Her teacher, Mrs. Klein, asked if it was a treehouse antenna. Rosie said no. It was what helped if everything else stopped. Meanwhile, Daniel spent 10 hours in heat, shimmer, and transformer noise, replacing weather-damaged disconnect hardware at a county pumping station while his phone gathered messages. 2 from clients, 1 from his foreman, 3 from Cynthia Weller. The final one arrived at 2:17 p.m. Mr. Mercer, please understand this matter concerns neighborhood standards, not your personal circumstances. He stared at that sentence longer than the others. Not your personal circumstances. As if widowhood, a daughter, a home business, and the practical labor of keeping systems alive were sentimental details he had attempted to smuggle into a compliance issue. As if the tower had been built to make a point, rather than because Daniel had spent enough nights in storm zones to know what failed first, what failed second, and what happened to ordinary families when everyone trusted infrastructure they had never personally inspected. He did not reply from the pumping station. He finished the job, signed the county sheet, drove home through a band of low-cloud building in the west, and found Rosie on the front steps with a library book open in her lap and a battery lantern beside her. The lantern was off. She had set it there intentionally. "What's that for?" he asked. She looked up. "Practice." "For what?" "In case the meeting is annoying." He stopped at the base of the steps and looked at her for a moment. The late light caught one side of her face. Elena had used to do that too. Meet irritation with dry precision instead of noise. Daniel sat beside her. The neighborhood around them was quiet in the curated way Oak Hollow preferred. Sprinklers clicked in measured arcs. A dog barked once behind a privacy fence and was immediately called inside. Across the street, someone's landscaper edged a driveway with surgical neatness. Everything looked controlled. That was the illusion. Daniel knew how fragile controlled things were. He had spent the last 3 years installing backup transfer systems for families who had once believed outages were inconveniences, not threats. He had wired refrigeration support for insulin patients, sump redundancy for low-lying homes, emergency panels for volunteer fire stations whose generators had failed under load because someone bought the cheaper regulator 5 years earlier and forgot about it. He knew the smell of overheated terminals. He knew how fast a neighborhood became frightened when polished normality went dark. And now the same block that liked his truck best when it was leaving wanted to fine him for the one system on Briar Court that had been built as if the weather might mean what it said. Rosie leaned lightly against his arm. "Are you going to take the papers?" "Yes." "Are you going to explain it?" "Yes." She thought about that. Will they listen? Daniel looked out toward the tower beyond the fence line, the upper frame catching the last dull silver of evening. He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "That depends on what they came there to do." Inside the house, on the kitchen table, he laid out the permits, county inspection approvals, electrical diagrams, fuel reserve calculations, and the load sheet showing exactly how the backup grid could sustain refrigeration, communications, emergency lighting, and limited medical support for 72 hours if municipal power failed. He clipped everything into order with the same care he brought to fieldwork. Rosie sat across from him, swinging one socked foot, watching the pages gather into a stack. "What if they still say no?" she asked. Daniel aligned the final document edge against the table. His voice stayed even. "Then they say no. And then?" He looked at her. Then he looked at the papers. Then at the window over the sink, where the sky in the west had darkened another shade without anyone in Oak Hollow seeming to notice. "Then," he said, "we find out what matters more, how something looks, or what it does." Thursday evening arrived with a sky the color of bruised steel and a wind that had not yet decided whether to become weather. Oak Hollow's clubhouse glowed warmly against it. Every window lit, every flower bed trimmed, every flagstone walkway swept clean enough to suggest that disorder was something that happened elsewhere, to other people, in neighborhoods without committees. Daniel Mercer parked beside a silver Lexus and a black Range Rover, shut off the engine of his old work truck, and sat for one moment with both hands on the wheel. The folder rested on the seat beside him. County permits, inspection stamps, engineering load sheets, fuel calculations, photographs of the conduit trench before it had been covered, a signed compliance letter from the county zoning office confirming that the tower fell under licensed contractor use allowances tied to emergency communications infrastructure. He had everything a reasonable board would need. That was not the same as having what this board wanted. Rosie sat in the passenger seat with her notebook on her lap and the small battery lantern tucked under one arm like a quiet joke only the two of them understood. She had asked to come. Daniel had considered saying no. Then he had remembered too many rooms where decisions about a child's life were made in the child's absence, and decided he was tired of that pattern. "You don't have to say anything in there," he told her. Rosie looked out at the clubhouse doors, where Cynthia Weller was already visible through the glass, greeting residents with practiced composure. "I know," Rosie said, "but I want to hear how they talk when they think they're being fair." Daniel opened the truck door. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee, lemon polish, and expensive hand lotion. 23 chairs had been arranged in rows facing the board table. The association seal hung on the wall behind it in brushed brass. Cynthia sat at the center seat with a leather portfolio open before her, and the expression of a woman who believed process itself was a moral achievement. To her right sat Martin Keene, the treasurer, a retired insurance executive who rarely initiated conflict, but almost always voted with Cynthia because agreement cost him less than thought. To her left sat Paula Renshaw, chair of Architectural Review, who had once filed a 3-page complaint about a satellite dish visible through winter branches. At the far end sat a younger board member named Ethan Pike, 2 years into his first term and already carrying the unsettled look of a man who had realized too late that neighborhood governance was mostly theater performed by people with disproportionate free time. Conversations thinned when Daniel and Rosie entered. Nobody said anything openly rude. Oak Hollow had better manners than that. But the glances arrived in sequence. His boots, her notebook, the folder in his hand, the fact that he had brought his daughter, the fact that he had not dressed for them. Cynthia's smile was immediate and bloodless. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Then, with a fractional pause, "And Rosie." Rosie gave a small nod and said nothing. Daniel took seats in the second row rather than at the back. It was a simple choice. It changed the room anyway. People expecting a defensive man preferred distance. Daniel did not offer it. At 7:02, Cynthia tapped her pen lightly against the agenda sheet. "This special compliance hearing of the Oak Hollow Estates Homeowners Association will come to order." She moved through the preliminaries with professional calm. Roll call, quorum confirmation, approval of prior minutes. Then item 4, exterior structure review, Lot 18, Briar Court. Her voice sharpened almost imperceptibly when she said his address. "As most present are aware," Cynthia began, "this matter concerns an unauthorized industrial-style tower installation and associated visible utility hardware extending above the fence line of the Mercer property. The board has received resident concerns regarding safety, aesthetics, and potential impact on neighborhood values." Daniel watched her while she spoke, not because he expected fairness to reveal itself in her face, because he had spent years in workrooms and municipal offices, learning that the first description of a problem often decided the moral tone before facts arrived. Cynthia was not introducing a structure. She was introducing a violation. Paula adjusted her glasses. Martin folded his hands. Ethan looked down at the photographs in the packet before him and frowned in a way that suggested he had not previously been given the full file. Cynthia continued, "Mr. Mercer, before the board considers enforcement options, you may offer any explanation you believe relevant. Any explanation, not documentation, not evidence. Explanation, as if he were there to justify a lapse in taste." Daniel stood, The folder in his hand made a soft, flat sound as he set it on the side table. The structure in question is county permitted, he said. It was inspected twice during installation and signed off under contractor use and emergency communications provisions tied to my licensed business. The antenna relay is not recreational, decorative, or improvised. It supports weather monitoring, backup communications, and load management for a private microgrid installed on the property. A few faces in the audience shifted. The language was more technical than they had expected. He opened the folder and handed copies down the row. You should all have the permit letters. The county zoning office confirmed compliance in writing 14 days ago. The electrical work was inspected under permit number 4473C. Fuel storage is within code. The tower setback exceeds county minimums. Cynthia did not touch the papers immediately. The county, she said, does not dictate HOA standards. No, Daniel said. But the county does determine whether something is safe and legal. A beat passed. Not everyone in the room liked that sentence. Too clear, too difficult to soften. Paula lifted the top letter, read the county seal, and said, "Legal doesn't necessarily mean appropriate for a residential community." Daniel nodded once. "Then we should probably be precise about what the concern is." Cynthia leaned back slightly. "Visual intrusion is one concern. From what distance?" She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "From what distance is the visual intrusion significant enough to justify removal?" Silence, brief but real. Daniel continued before she could recover the frame. "Because the tower extends above the fence line by design. It has to. Signal equipment doesn't work underground. If the objection is that it can be seen, then the board should say how much visibility is too much, under what rule, and according to what standard." The room went quieter. Nobody laughed after that. This was not anger. It was something more difficult for the board to manage. Competence that did not perform itself loudly. Cynthia placed both hands on the table. "Mr. Mercer, the board is not required to adopt your technical framing. We are discussing neighborhood character." Rosie, seated beside the aisle, looked up at that. Daniel heard it too. Character. The word people used when they wanted taste to outrank function. He reached for the load sheet. "This system was built because we've had 4 major outage events in 3 years across the county. During the ice storm in January, the substation on Route 9 ran on partial redundancy for 11 hours. During the June wind event, the west feeder dropped and took communications with it in 2 sectors. I work those failures. I know what breaks first." Martin Keene finally looked up. "And that justifies a tower in a subdivision. It justifies preparation." Cynthia gave a small, polished exhale. "Preparation for what, exactly?" "Oak Hollow is not a remote farm district. We have municipal utilities, county response access, and service restoration priority." Daniel turned toward him, not her. "With respect, those systems are only as good as the maintenance behind them." The sentence landed harder than its volume suggested. He did not dramatize. He did not speculate. He spoke like a man describing a panel rating. Cynthia's expression cooled. "This is beginning to sound alarmist." "No," Daniel said. "It sounds experienced." The room held still. Only later would several of the residents present admit to themselves that this was the moment the hearing changed. Until then, Daniel had been the man with the ugly tower. After that sentence, he became the man who knew exactly how little their polished assumptions were worth under strain. Paula cleared her throat. "Even if one accepted your reasoning, the structure remains inconsistent with community aesthetics." Daniel looked at her. "Then let's be honest. The objection isn't safety. It isn't legality. It isn't code. It's that some of you don't like how readiness looks." Cynthia's pen stopped moving. "That's unfair," she said. "No," Daniel said. "It's specific." A murmur moved through the audience. Not agreement exactly. Recognition. In the third row, a woman named Helen Baird, whose husband used a home oxygen concentrator at night and had lost power for 6 hours the previous summer, shifted in her seat and looked more closely at the diagrams. Near the back, a younger Father Daniel knew only as Trevor folded his arms and frowned toward the board rather than at Daniel. Small things. But rooms turn on small things first. Cynthia saw it too. Her next move came quickly. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "With all due respect, many homeowners manage emergencies without erecting industrial apparatus in their yards. This board has to think of everyone." Daniel's face did not change. "This board," he said, "scheduled fines before hearing a word from me." That landed. He let the sentence sit there. Then he reached into the folder and held up the pre-drafted enforcement schedule. $200 initial penalty, $50 a day after non-compliance. Legal review language already inserted. So let's not pretend tonight began as a conversation. For the first time, Ethan Pike looked directly at Cynthia. Martin shifted in his chair. Paula's mouth tightened. Cynthia answered carefully. "Preliminary paperwork is standard. Before investigation, before delay," she said. There it was. Not caution, not governance. Control. Rosie had been quiet the entire time, but now she turned to Daniel and asked in a voice small enough to be innocent and clear enough to carry, "Is this the part where they already decided?" Nobody in the room moved for half a second. Children do that sometimes. They remove the decorative language from adult conduct and leave the structure exposed. Cynthia's smile returned, thinner now. "Rosie, the board is simply trying to preserve the neighborhood for all families." Rosie looked at her with calm, 8-year-old concentration. "But if the lights went out," she said, "our tower could still help families." The room went quiet again. Daniel did not interrupt her. Rosie held the battery lantern in both hands, not turning it on, just resting her fingers on the handle. "Dad said backup doesn't mean you want bad things. It means you don't want people stuck if bad things happen." Helen Baird lowered her eyes to the paperwork. Trevor looked toward the windows, where the wind had begun to push harder against the glass. Cynthia replied with the controlled patience adults use when they need a child's truth to sound like a misunderstanding. "That's very thoughtful, Rosie. But communities also need standards." Rosie nodded once, as if accepting a data point she did not especially respect. Daniel placed one hand lightly on the back of her chair and looked at the board. "The tower stays," he said, "unless you can show me a governing restriction it violates that overrides county approval and business use allowance. Not preference, not discomfort. A rule." Paula began leafing through the covenants. Martin looked at Cynthia again. Ethan said, for the first time that evening, "Do we actually have a specific structural restriction that applies here?" Cynthia did not answer immediately. That silence mattered more than any speech. Outside, beyond the clubhouse windows, the first low roll of thunder crossed the sky so far away it might have been mistaken for traffic if Daniel had not spent half his life listening to systems before they failed. He turned his head slightly toward the sound, then back to the board. And for the first time that night, Cynthia Weller looked less like a woman conducting a hearing and more like a woman realizing the room might not remain arranged around her for much longer. The second roll of thunder came closer, not loud, not theatrical, just near enough to pull several heads toward the clubhouse windows at once. The glass reflected the room back at itself, Cynthia at the center seat, Daniel standing beside the evidence she had not wanted, Rosie small and still in the second row, and 23 residents beginning, one by one, to understand that the evening might not end inside the narrow little script the board had prepared. Ethan Pike was still holding the covenant packet open. "I'm asking a direct question," he said, and the fact that he sounded younger now did not make the question weaker. "Do we have a rule that specifically prohibits a permitted emergency communication structure tied to a licensed home business?" Cynthia turned to him with a smile that had carried her through 6 years of unchallenged meetings. It was less effective now. "The board has broad discretion regarding exterior visual violations." "That's not what I asked." A beat passed. Paula Renshaw began turning pages faster than she had been. Martin Keene removed his reading glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on with the slow caution of a man who already suspected the answer and did not like what it would cost him. Daniel said nothing. He had spent enough years around failing systems to know the value of silence once the right pressure had been applied. People often revealed more while trying to protect their position than they ever would under direct attack. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the clubhouse siding. The flower beds along the front walk bent in one direction, then held there. Helen Baird raised a hand from the third row. Cynthia did not want to call on her. That much was visible. But too many people had already turned to look. "Yes, Helen? My husband's oxygen unit failed during that outage in July," Helen said. "We had battery support for a while, but not long enough. If Mr. Mercer's system can actually provide emergency power assistance, I'd like to know whether that matters in this discussion." Cynthia folded her hands. "This is not a public utility hearing." "No," Helen said. "It's a hearing about whether we find the only person on this block who seems to have planned for a real emergency." The room shifted again. Trevor, from the back row, spoke without raising his hand. "How many people complained exactly?" Cynthia's eyes moved toward him. Several concerns were communicated informally. "How many formally?" She did not answer immediately. Trevor leaned forward. "Because if this whole thing started from one person disliking how a tower looks, that's different from a neighborhood issue." Daniel watched Cynthia understand, in real time, that control was thinning. Not gone, not yet, but thinning. Then the lights went out. No flicker, no warning. One moment warm clubhouse light lay across the polished table and the brass association seal. The next moment everything dropped into black. Someone gasped. A chair scraped. One of the residents near the door let out a short, involuntary sound, and then laughed at herself too quickly. Outside, the storm had finally arrived in full, and rain began hitting the windows in hard diagonal bursts. For half a second nobody moved. Then Rosie clicked on the battery lantern. The small white light came up between her hands, steady and clean, illuminating her face, Daniel's sleeve, the edge of the second row, and nothing else. It was not enough to fill the room. It was enough to change it. Daniel was already reaching for his phone. "Everyone stay seated," he said, calm and level. "Don't crowd the exits." He turned on the flashlight, angled it toward the floor, and handed it to the resident nearest the aisle. "Point it down, not in anyone's eyes." A few more phones lit across the room, but the effect was scattered and nervous. Daniel stepped toward the windows, checked the parking lot, then looked toward the ceiling fixtures. "No emergency backup?" Trevor asked. Martin Keene gave a strained little cough. "The clubhouse generator was removed 2 years ago. Maintenance recommendation? Cost issue." Daniel looked at him. "Battery emergency lights?" Paula answered from the darkness too quickly. "They were supposed to." "Supposed to," Rosie said softly. Nobody commented on that. Cynthia was trying very hard to sound composed. "This is inconvenient, but I'm sure utility service will be restored shortly." Daniel turned toward her voice. Maybe only later would Cynthia understand how much damage that one word did. Not because it was rude, because it was the first time in years anyone in that room had answered her certainty with something stronger than argument. Another thunderclap hit, close enough this time to rattle the window frames. Then came the sound Daniel had been listening for since he arrived. The hard, irregular, metallic stutter of a compromised transformer somewhere west of the clubhouse. He knew that sound. He had heard it in school districts, pump yards, church basements, clinic backlots. It was the sound of a system failing beyond a quick reset. He moved to the window again, looked toward the subdivision entrance, and saw what he had expected. No street lights, no gate lighting, no landscape uplighting along the median. The whole front section of Oak Hollow had gone dark at once. "How long?" Helen asked. Daniel answered honestly. "If it's feeder side and weather related, could be an hour, could be longer." A murmur moved through the room. "Longer changed things." Longer made medicine matter. Refrigeration, garage doors, sump systems, phones, children. Cynthia stood. Even in the dark, the gesture carried old authority. I think the appropriate thing is to adjourn and let everyone return home. Daniel turned toward her. In this rain, with the entrance gate down and no backup lighting, we can't sit here indefinitely. No, he said. But you also can't send people blindly into a dark lot if the access arm failed closed. Ethan checked through the front glass with his phone light. It failed closed. That landed harder than the outage itself. The gate at Oak Hollow was ornamental security in good weather and a bottleneck in bad weather. Everyone in the room knew it. Nobody had ever needed to say it aloud before. Daniel was already moving. There's a manual release housing by the entrance post, he said. If the actuator battery is dead, I can get it open, Cynthia said. You can't just start tampering with HOA property. He looked at her then, really looked at her. And in the cold white spill of Rosie's lantern and the scattered phone lights, the sentence sounded so small that even Martin winced. Nobody laughed after that, Trevor said from the back, not quite under his breath. A few people did then, briefly. Not because any of this was funny, because the room had finally reached the point where Cynthia's authority and Cynthia's judgment no longer looked like the same thing. Daniel ignored it. He crouched beside Rosie. Stay with Mrs. Baird if I step outside. Rosie nodded. Take the red-handled multi-tool. It's in your side pocket. He almost smiled. Already there, he stood and looked at the room. Anyone with medical equipment, refrigeration meds, or someone at home alone who needs power. Say it now. 3 hands went up immediately. Helen's, Trevor's, a man near the rear named Luis whose mother used a powered lift chair. Then, after a pause, 2 more. The room had changed completely. Not aesthetics now. Not standards. Need. Daniel gave quick instructions. Stay here until I check the gate and assess the line side from the entrance. If the outage holds, my truck inverter can charge phones immediately. And my home system can take limited critical loads once we know who needs what. Cynthia said nothing. He stepped into the storm. Rain hit him sideways before he cleared the awning. The clubhouse path was already taking on water in the seams between the stones. He moved fast across the lot, boots cutting through runoff, beam low and steady. The entrance gate motor housing was exactly what he expected. Unmaintained, poorly sealed, backup battery dead. 4 minutes later, the arm was released manually. He chained it open so it would not drift halfway down and trap someone underneath. Then he checked the service pedestal. Main feed fault. Not local. No easy recovery. When he came back into the clubhouse soaked through at the shoulders, the room went quiet in a different way than before. Not the silence of tension. The silence people give a man returning with the answer. Gates open, he said. Power's not coming back quickly. Helen asked the next question before Cynthia could reassemble herself. What do we do? Daniel set the multi-tool on the board table beside Cynthia's untouched packet and answered the room, not the president. Anyone who needs immediate charging, stay organized. Anyone with medicine, refrigeration, or powered equipment, give me your address. My system can support critical loads in rotation if we manage it. No space heaters, no luxury circuits. Essentials. Martin stared at him. Your house can do that? Daniel looked at him once. That's what I tried to explain. The room went still. There are moments when power reveals itself by speaking. This was not one of them. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not remind them what they had called his tower. He did not ask for apologies before offering help. He simply began solving the problem. Within 12 minutes, the hearing room had turned into something else. A staging point. Addresses were written on the back of agenda sheets. Residents paired up by street. Trevor and Luis volunteered to help carry coolers and extension-rated refrigeration packs from garages. Ethan, now fully out from under Cynthia's shadow, took names and needs with practical efficiency. Helen called her husband and told him to sit tight. Rosie, still holding the lantern, read addresses aloud with careful precision while Daniel sorted the order of priority. Cynthia stood near the board table with both hands braced against it, saying very little. Only later would she understand that this was the true reversal, not the outage itself, not even the help Daniel provided. It was the sight of the neighborhood reorganizing around competence instead of title. By 9:10, the first residents were following Daniel's truck through the rain toward Briar Court. His backyard glowed with hard utility light against the storm. Not bright enough to look extravagant, bright enough to look prepared. The tower stood above the fence line, gray and narrow and absolutely steady in the wind. Conduit lines vanished into the workshop. Inside, the inverter bank hummed with the low, disciplined sound of stored energy doing exactly what it had been built to do. Nobody called it a rusting tower now. Helen's medication cooler went on to circuit priority 2. Luis's mother's lift chair battery pack began charging at the bench outlet near the workshop sink. Trevor's freezer drawer got tagged for a 30-minute preservation cycle. Phones lined the counter. A portable lamp went to the Bairds. Another to the house on Hawthorne where an infant monitor had died. Daniel worked through it all, with the calm rhythm of a field operator. Not wasting motion, not wasting words. Rosie stayed near the load panel with her notebook, crossing off names as each need was stabilized. Cynthia arrived last. She had driven herself, which in Oak Hollow usually meant control. Tonight it looked like hesitation that had taken too long to become humility. She stood just inside the workshop door, rain on her coat sleeves, looking first at the battery banks, then the transfer panel. Then the residents moving quietly through the space she had tried to classify as an eyesore. Daniel was tightening a connector on a temporary medical refrigeration unit when she said his name. He looked up. For the first time since he had known her, Cynthia Weller appeared to have no prepared tone available to her. "I was wrong," she said. He said nothing. She glanced toward the residents being helped, toward Rosie at the notebook, toward the tower beyond the wet glass of the workshop window. "I treated this as a vanity issue. I assumed," she stopped. Perhaps because the sentence she had started had no version that did not expose her. "I assumed I understood what I was looking at." Daniel set the tool down. "That's usually when people make the expensive mistake," he said. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to resist. Cynthia nodded once, as if accepting terms from reality rather than from him. "The fines will be withdrawn. The hearing record will be corrected. I'll call an emergency board vote tomorrow morning to classify the structure as approved emergency infrastructure." Rosie looked up from the notebook. "So now it has character?" A beat passed, then Helen laughed. Trevor did too. Even Ethan, standing by the charger bank with 3 phones in hand, turned away to hide a smile. Cynthia closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, some part of the performance had gone out of her. "Yes," she said quietly. "Now I think it does." The storm held for another 3 hours. By midnight, critical loads across Oak Hollow had been stabilized in rotation. Daniel's system did exactly what he had said it would do. Not magic, not limitless, just disciplined, measurable readiness. The kind that comes from knowing failure is never theoretical to the people trapped inside it. Municipal power returned at 12:43 a.m. One by one, the temporary lamps went dark. Chargers clicked off. Refrigeration transfer packs were unplugged. The workshop, so full for hours, began to empty. Residents thanked Daniel in the restrained, slightly stunned way people do when gratitude arrives tangled with embarrassment. Several promised to speak at the board meeting. Martin Keene shook Daniel's hand with both of his. Ethan asked if he could review the emergency planning documents sometime. Helen hugged Rosie before leaving and whispered something that made the girl nod solemnly. At last, the yard was quiet again. Rain dripped from the eaves. The tower stood above the fence line, unchanged by argument, unchanged by vindication, doing what it had always done. Daniel shut the workshop door halfway and sat on the back step with Rosie beside him. The night smelled of wet cedar, mud, and cooling metal. Somewhere down the block, power-hungry systems were waking back up all at once. Garage doors, refrigerators, routers, the ordinary electrical heartbeat of a neighborhood that had just spent several hours learning how thin its confidence had been. Rosie leaned against his shoulder. "Are they still going to have meetings?" she asked. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Probably. About important things? Sometimes." She looked toward the tower. "Do you think they know now what it does?" Daniel followed her gaze. The upper signal light blinked once, steady and small against the clearing dark. "Yes," he said. "I think they do now." A moment passed, then Rosie asked the question that mattered more than the hearing, more than Cynthia, more than the board vote that would come in the morning. "Did Mom know you'd build things like this?" Daniel looked down at his hands. Rainwater had dried in pale lines across his knuckles. Grease sat under one thumbnail, the ordinary evidence of a life spent holding systems together. "She knew I couldn't sleep if I hadn't planned for the worst thing properly," he said. Rosie considered that with the quiet seriousness that was so much like Elena it still hurt sometimes. Then she slipped her hand into his. The yard was dim now except for the workshop light and the small indicator lamps on the battery rack. No audience, no board, no room to convince, just a father, his daughter, and the equipment he had built because someone had to think ahead for people who did not. After a while, Rosie said, "I'm glad the tower stayed." Daniel looked out into the dark, where Oak Hollow's tidy roofs and perfect hedges sat under a sky that had already moved on from threatening them. "So am I," he said, and in the quiet that followed, with the storm behind them and the neighborhood finally understanding the difference between appearance and value, the thing Cynthia Weller had tried to remove stood over Briar Court exactly as it had before. Plain, visible, unglamorous, and indispensable.